Welcome to episode 2 of the Grail Standard with your host, Sir Vane. So today I wanted to talk about the book that started the idea for this podcast, which was a book called Chivalry, an Ideal Whose Time Has Come Again, written by George of Cappadocia. Now, this book was written in 2024, and this book, I would say, changed my life, like dramatically. Before this book was written, I was focused on being a businessman, and to be honest, I just wasn't very good at it. But looking back on it, I think that might not be a bad thing. I've always been someone who, even from a young age, loved the idea of chivalry. I love Captain America. I love the stories of King Arthur. The King Arthur games are my absolute favorite games. I think, like, when I say the King Arthur games, what I'm talking about is, it's called the King Arthur Collection, by the publisher, just finding them now. By the publisher by developer Neocore Games. The King Arthur, the role-playing war game. The reason that I really loved this game, and the reason why I really loved Captain America, was I felt that these were heroes that stood for something. You know what I mean? I've always loved the idea of chivalry. I've always loved the idea how knights, like the old code from the movie Dragonheart, his might defends the weak. I've always been a person who was motivated by social justice, right? But I found myself wanting to serve society, but not feeling the way to do it. I was a proponent of capitalism at the time, but I just felt that I wanted something. And then I found this book, and I had been aware of chivalry before, but this book revitalized me. Before this book, when I looked into being a gentleman, it was always about the clothes that you wore, mustache gels, and all sort of that stuff, which I just don't feel has anything to do with real chivalry. Now, when I say chivalry, I mean, from an historical perspective, it was seen as a code for men, but I really think that it can be a code for anyone. It's really a code for anyone who wants to be a protector in society. You want to have the best of both worlds. Like, there's a quote from the book, which is in the introduction chapter, which I absolutely love. This is from Sir Ector's eulogy for Lancelot from De Mortre d'Arthur. "And thou were the most courteous knight that ever bare shield, and thou were the kindest man that ever struck sword, and thou were the goodliest person that ever came among press of knights, and thou were the meekest man, and the gentlest that ever ate in the hall among ladies, and thou were the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in the rest." The point was, this book and this code is all about what chivalry is about. It's about the duality of being strong enough to protect those around you while at the same time being courteous, which I feel that has been lost, or at least it's been twisted. Especially when you get people like Andrew Tate, who, when they talk about toxic masculinity, I'm not going to say that Andrew Tate doesn't have his moments, but the fact that it was found out that he was essentially as a pimp means I think that nowadays, especially when you look at the Andrew Tates of the world, there are a lot of male role models who I would call toxic masculinity. And that's not a term that I like to use because they make it sound like all masculinity is bad. But I just think that's because there aren't enough good representatives of masculinity. And I feel in some way, to some extent, so the society is the reason for this. Because if you look at like movies, especially with the modern day Marvel movies, it's almost like being a man is regarded as being bad. Like all the characters that I see in modern movies, they're always, all the males, they're always stupid or not very moral or just not very, I don't know, tradition, masculine's not the term, but not very chivalrous, not like Lancelot. I would say, I think a better term than masculine is knightly. They don't have knightly attributes, right? And so, in the book Chivalry and Ideal, Whose Time Has Come Again, the traits of chivalry are prowess, courtesy, honor, generosity, loyalty, and faith, right? Now, the person who wrote this book wrote it from, they're a Catholic, and they wrote it from a Catholic perspective, but I feel that even if you're not a Christian, I still believe that this book and the ideal of chivalry has value to you, right? For those of you who don't know, for instance, there is a saint amongst the Christians called Saint George, and he was a Turkish Muslim who converted to Christianity. He's idolized as Saint George the Dragon Slayer. So the point that I'm getting at is that anyone of any faith can take these values on. Even though they were traditionally Christian, you don't have to be a Christian in order to find chivalry. If, for instance, if you're looking into Buddhism and you're a proponent of the Eight Noble Path, this would be useful to you. So I feel that this is a view. It does have a Christian history, and there are certain things that are traditionally Christian about it. But I don't believe that you have to be a Christian for you to embody chivalry. I also don't think that you have to be a man to embody chivalry. You just have to be someone who wants to serve the community. But it's very important for men because men are traditionally stronger than women, and with being stronger, I think when chivalry was created, it was more because when people think of a knight nowadays, they think of a knight in shining armor like King Arthurian mythology. But back then, it really just meant a guy with a sword, and the whole concept of chivalry is where manners come from. Chivalry were basically meant to inspire the strong men to follow a code and not go around pillaging and doing other things. So it was meant to be a code that started as a way to keep the knights in check, but grew into something else more entirely. And where literally, I suppose you could say, climaxed or with the origin of the King Arthurian stories, which are an absolute must-read. I'm still getting through them, but they're an absolute must-read. So, I wanted to talk about prowess today, which is the first of the virtues. So, what is prowess? Now, in modern society, being violent is seen as a bad thing. And there's a quote that comes to mind when I think of that don't fear the weapon, feel the hand that wields it. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that it's not the weapon that is itself dangerous, it's the hand that's wielding it. So the point is that, like guns, they can be used by bad people to do bad things. But they can also be used by good people to do good things. And the statistics show that in America, defensive guns actually save more lives than they take them in the hands of criminals. So this comes down to a fact that you need to have prowess to protect your community. Now, that means having physical strength and training to fight. But also, we will talk about the next virtue later on, which is courtesy, which is a companion. Courtesy and honor, which are companions to this. But in other words, you need to have the strength to protect yourself from evil, to protect yourself, your family, and your community from evil people. Right? This means going to the gym and lifting weights. Weights are a great thing. Even if you have injuries, obviously you should go to a physio if you have injuries, but even if you don't know anything about weights, you can go to the gym and do isolationist and use the machines, and they pretty much do the work for you. They help you with your form. As long as you're not lifting more than you can lift, it's very hard with machines if you're using basic form to hurt yourself, right? So you should build strength, but there's a couple of reasons for this, right? The reason that you should work out at the gym is because it builds the trait of mental toughness. Not just physical strength, but mental toughness. It's important. So if you're going to be preparing to fight for your community, you need to be mentally tough. And it's easy to talk about toughness in an abstract sense, and you can read books, but toughness is not something that you can read in a book. Like, it's like they say in the old adage, the more you sweat in the gym, the more blood and sweat you bleed in the gym, the less blood you bleed in the ring. So the point is that, like, I'm not saying you have to train like an MMA fighter, right? At that elite level. But you do need to be physically strong, right? So that you can... So, for instance, if you're at a bar and somebody is trying to attack you, you have the physical strength to defend yourself, right? The other thing is that the more that you train and the more confident you become in your strength, it translates to the way that you carry yourself in the world, right? Your posture will be more upright. You'll look more traditional. You'll look stronger. You'll look more like somebody that villains will not want to contend with. And so strength isn't a bad thing. It's just that in the wrong hands, it can be used to do evil. But the reality is, if good people do nothing, bad people win. So then we're also going to talk about training to fight, which is where prowess comes in, right? But before we talk about training to fight, this isn't telling you to always jump the gun and go for a fight at the first opportunity, right? If you're in a potentially violent encounter, you should try to de-escalate. And I'll talk more about that in later verses. But the point is, there's a great book on this that you can find on either Everand or Amazon, which is called Verbal Judo. And Verbal Judo is a great book because it's actually the skill of how to de-escalate situations, which is an important skill to have, right? But if you can't de-escalate, right, then you need to actually be ready to throw down if that's what it comes to. You also need to know where to understand when you can de-escalate and when you can't de-escalate, but you should try to de-escalate first. So the point is that, like, that's what prowess is. Prowess is training to fight and training to be strong. Now, this isn't the same as bodybuilding. You're focusing on functional strength. So you're not necessarily focusing on trying to build the biggest muscles that you can. What you want to do is focus on functional movements. So the chest press, chin-ups, leg press, those are really good exercises for... And the rowing machine. Oh, dear God, the rowing machine is awesome. The rowing machine is one of those machines that is one of the few machines that combines entire body strength and cardio in one. It's an absolutely incredible machine. If you go to a gym, you'll see almost nobody uses it. It's a really awesome machine. And if you've ever seen rowers who are professional rowers, their shoulders are massive. My point is, though, is you need to build strength, right? But when we talk about prowess, we also talk about the just war theory, right? Now, this just war theory has been written in one of the books by Thomas Aquinas, but it's in the book. The point that I'm getting at is that sometimes in my life, I have luckily only once had to defend myself physically, but what I've found is understanding that you know how to fight changes the game when people are dealing with you. Now, this is what I'm also going to say. I don't recommend that you go around telling people if you know how to fight, because a lot of the times it will bring trouble. But you need to understand that just knowing how to fight will make you more comfortable in dealing with conflict. It will also, sometimes men will test you to see if you break, right? Depending upon what cultures you're referring to. Sometimes they will test you, right? And if you know that in a fight you can fight, you're going to be less likely to show fear because you're confident about your abilities in that regard. Now, I'm not saying you should underestimate people, but the thing is, sometimes just being able to stay calm when someone is provoking you can de-escalate the situation, because they might realize, well, this person's not afraid, and they might move on. But prowess is something that is juxtaposed later on when we talk about courtesy and meekness. But the point is that prowess is really important. Without prowess, you have no chivalry, right? Now, the other thing that we're going to talk about that's in the book that seems to be under attack with Marvel is loving heroes. Now, if you've been following, especially the Marvel Cinematic Universe after a while, you would have noticed that there seems to be an attack on heroes. And the thing is that loving heroes is a part of prowess, idolizing heroes. Who do I mean like heroes? People like Captain America. Heroes, King Arthur. Even if these people aren't real, these people embody traditional chivalry. And it seems to me that for some strange reason, this is under attack, and you just need to not partake in. You need to not partake in this, right? If you can't find heroes, look into your religion. You'll find people worthy of value, or just look in culture in general. There are many examples of heroes. Like there's the stories of King Arthur that I was talking about before, that are one of the best heroic stories that I've ever seen, because they talk about really complex topics, and they all represent something. You've got modern day heroes like Captain America, Batman, but these traditionally masculine heroes, right? Obviously, irrespective of what sex or gender you are, you could, especially nowadays, it'll probably be a lot easier to find heroes if you're, say, not traditionally masculine than it would be if you are. If you're traditionally masculine, you're probably going to be looking at the older heroes. Simply put, because they're the ones that were created before modern day DEI started to destroy male role models. But the point is that like loving heroes is a part of prowess. And for some reason, this is seen as a bad thing amongst the modern day dialogue. But there's as Balthasar Gracian writes in The Art of Worldly Wisdom, there are examples of greatness, living texts of honor. Let everyone have before his mind the chief of his calling, not so much to follow him as to spur himself on. Nothing arouses ambition so much in the heart of the trumpet clang of another's fame. The same thing that sharpens envy nourishes a generous spirit. So my point is, having heroes that you idolize, whether they're fictional or not, is important, right? So when even if you look at like people like stories like Conan the Barbarian, right? Not that I would say that he's the best hero, but the point is that especially like when you talk about heroes like from ancient times and from medieval times, right? People who face down danger on the front lines to lead their men. Those are the types of heroes that I'm talking about, right? Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be a soldier, but these people who are seen as scions of toxic masculinity they may not have been the most perfect examples in their lives, but the point is that, like it says before, you need to have models to look up to, and to not just to emulate but to surpass. I want to end with the quote from the last paragraph from the book on the chapter about Prowess, and it says, "Chivalry trains a man to feel something inside the ribcage at the thought of heroes like this." Obviously he's talking about Richard the Lionheart. "There are, to go back to Gratian, examples of greatness, living texts of honor which nourish a generous spirit." And so this is where the importance of role models comes from, especially for male role models, because they mostly seem to be under attack nowadays, especially if you watch mainstream shows. I remember seeing a video a while back where they were talking about with the newest Doom game, the main hero was too masculine. The point is that for traditionally masculine men, finding role models is a lot more difficult. So you got your Captain Americas, you got your King Arthurs, you got your, I don't know if you would say Batman, but the point is that Prowess is all about loving heroes, but not just because they have strength, but because they have courage. Because that's the real thing that makes the difference makes Prowess, but it's a combination of prowess and courage, right? That really makes chivalry, or at least they are a part of it. So if in relation to prowess, we talk about training to fight. If I was to talk about training to fight, it would mean you want to have some basic grappling and striking. In terms of basic striking, you could go with boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, MMA, any of those. Others are supplemental, but really you just want to be able to use your hands. The good thing about boxing is that I know that people say this often, but it's simple to learn and hard to master. There actually is a lot to boxing that you can spend an entire life learning about boxing, and I will talk about those in a later episode. But the point that I want to get at is you want to learn how to strike, right? The other thing that you do want to learn is grappling. Now, in terms of grappling, you've actually got a lot more, what you could say, variation on practical forms of grappling. So you got judo, sambo, wrestling, traditional jiu-jitsu. You got Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which more focuses on the ground aspect. But anything like judo and wrestling are actually really good because they focus on the stand-up game, which is really what you need to learn in terms of defense. Another good style is the Filipino martial arts known as FMA, which is Arnis de Mano, Eskrima, Silat, any of those. But really, boxing and wrestling are really good. Boxing or judo are also really good because judo will build a lot of strength, so does wrestling. Judo and wrestling are kind of different from each other in terms of what they focus on, but they both teach grappling. Judo does teach weapon disarms, which can be useful for a street fight, but really it's more about learning about grappling. And when you combine the two, which is dirty boxing, which is the combination of wrestling and grappling, that's where you start to become, that's much more realistic in terms of like the street. So, like I said, anything that's supplemental to that is great. But basically learning how to whether you do boxing or kickboxing or Muay Thai will teach you the basics of striking, which are very useful. And then you got like a basic grappling style. Anything else to that is supplemental. The Filipino martial arts teach how to use the stick and knife, and also teach weapon disarms, including, if you want to learn about knife defense, you really should study the Filipino martial arts because they teach you how to use knives, but also if you understand how to use a knife, it's easier to defend against it because you understand the angles of attack. Some people will disagree with this, but in my opinion, Filipino martial arts is the only style that actually teaches you how to knife fight. So those are the basic things that I will learn in prowess. Combine that with weightlifting, and you'll have a good all-around. And the thing is, boxing or MMA and kickboxing is really easy to find. Same as judo. It's everywhere. Wrestling is harder to find, but it is there, especially if you're in America. You can find a lot of wrestling classes. But judo is very easy to find. So that's one of the things that I would recommend when you're looking into prowess. If you're in America, you also might want to look into firearms. But the thing that I will say about firearms is that unless you are an old person and you've lost a lot of physical strength, you should know how to use your fists before you resort to firearms, unless it's absolutely necessary. Firearms are lethal force, so if you were in America in a concealed carry state, it would be a different story. Then you should actually, in my opinion, if you feel that you need to, you should carry a firearm. Now, there's some debates about whether or not, like, if you look at like places like Texas where they have a larger amount of firearms, they also have a very low amount of crime. So I'm not really going to get into that. But for Prowess, we're going to focus on you need to know how to fight with your hands, basic striking, basic grappling. The good things about judo is that if you, depending upon what you learn, they might also teach you jiu-jitsu, which will teach you wrist locks, and there's a lot of different locks that you can use to pin people down. Wrestling is good because it teaches you how to grapple without a gear, how to make use of the overhand, what's it called? The overhook and the underhook. Greco-Roman wrestling is of absolute applicability because it focuses on grappling from the waist up. Whereas the problem with like doing like double leg takedowns like you would see in wrestling is that they kind of rely you to slam your knee on the ground and put it in between a person's legs, which might shatter your knee. So Greco-Roman wrestling is actually really useful. There was an MMA fighter by the name of Randy Couture who used to use it. Any books by him are really good because he teaches you how to use dirty boxing, which is the combination of wrestling and boxing, which is actually really useful. So this was the Grail standard on Prowess. I was your host, Sir Vane. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I will see you on the next one.